Snow fell silently over the nearly empty tree lot as Richard Hayes checked his Rolex. Christmas Eve, and his penthouse still needed that perfect centerpiece. The sagging tree was the last one left, pathetic really, but it would have to do. As he handed over his crisp $100 bill, a teenage girl stepped forward from the shadows, her eyes filled with recognition and pain. "You're my father's killer," she whispered. Richard's blood turned colder than the December air. In an instant, the successful CEO was thrust back 5 years to the day his company's construction crane collapsed, a day he'd spent millions to forget. Could redemption possibly be found between a broken man and the daughter of the worker he'd sacrificed for profit? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Richard Hayes stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, 42 stories above the city. From this height, people were merely specks moving along predetermined paths, just as he preferred them. Distant, manageable, and ultimately irrelevant to his personal sphere. The glass walls that surrounded him had become both his triumph and his prison. "Mr. Hayes," his executive assistant's voice broke through his thoughts. "The board is waiting in the conference room." Richard straightened his custom-tailored suit jacket without turning around. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes, Margaret. And sir, don't forget about the company Christmas party tonight." A slight tightening of his jaw was the only indication of his annoyance. "Put in an appearance for 30 minutes, then have a car waiting." The usual excuse. "Yes, sir." Margaret hesitated at the door. "And the gifts for the executive's children have been arranged. Would you like to sign the cards yourself this year?" "That won't be necessary." Richard finally turned, his expression unreadable. "Just sign my name as you always do." After she left, Richard returned to the window. Below, the city was decorated with Christmas lights, a spectacle he observed with clinical detachment rather than joy. Christmas had become nothing more than an obligation, a series of gestures performed to maintain appearances. His phone buzzed with a reminder. Tree. Even this personal task had been reduced to a single-word prompt in his calendar. For the past 5 years, Richard had maintained the same routine. Purchase a tree on Christmas Eve, set it up in his penthouse, and spend the evening alone with expensive scotch and classical music. No family gatherings, no meaningful traditions, just the trappings of a holiday that had lost its meaning long ago. The conference room fell silent as Richard entered. 8 board members straightened in their chairs, a Pavlovian response to his presence. He had cultivated this atmosphere of respectful fear throughout Hayes' development, finding it more effective than friendship or loyalty. "Gentlemen, ladies," he nodded curtly. "Let's make this quick. I have a flight to catch." There was no flight, but the lie came easily. Richard had discovered years ago that people rarely questioned a busy man. Busyness was the perfect shield against unwanted invitations and personal inquiries. Later, as Richard endured the company Christmas party, he moved efficiently through the crowd, offering practice smiles and brief handshakes. Employees parted before him like water, conversations faltering as he passed. He caught fragments of their lives, children's recitals, family traditions, shared jokes, all foreign concepts in his world. Great party, Richard. Thomas Weldon, his CFO, appeared at his side with 2 glasses of champagne. "Your assistant outdid herself this year." Richard accepted the glass without drinking. "Yes, Margaret is very efficient." "Any plans for the holidays?" "My wife and I are taking the grandkids to Aspen." "Work never stops, Tom. The Robinson Project needs attention." Another practiced lie. Back in his penthouse that evening, Richard removed his tie and poured 3 fingers of 30-year-old scotch. The space was immaculate, minimalist, and devoid of personal touches. No family photos, no mementos, nothing that couldn't be replaced with a phone call and his platinum card. He realized he had forgotten the tree, the perfect centerpiece for his perfect, empty life. With a sigh, he retrieved his coat. There would still be lots open, desperate to unload their remaining inventory before Christmas morning. As he rode the elevator down, Richard caught his reflection in the polished brass. Dawes, a successful man by every measurable standard, yet the face that stared back at him seemed to belong to a stranger, a man who had everything and nothing at all. The concierge nodded respectfully as Richard strode through the lobby. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Hayes. Is there a Christmas tree lot still open nearby?" Richard asked, ignoring the greeting. "There's a small one about 15 minutes away, sir. Family-run place. They might still be open." Richard nodded and stepped out into the cold December night, unaware that his precisely ordered life was about to collide with a past he had paid handsomely to forget. Emma Sullivan rubbed her gloved hands together and exhaled a cloud of vapor into the frigid air. The Christmas tree lot was nearly empty now, just 3 scraggly pines remaining under the string of colored lights her mother had insisted on hanging to keep the holiday spirit alive. The spirit, however, had departed hours ago, along with most of their inventory and potential customers. "We did well this year," her mother Linda said from behind the small wooden booth where they kept the cash box. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, but Emma appreciated the effort. "Better than last year," Emma agreed, though they both knew it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough since Dad died. Emma's gaze drifted to the silver-framed photograph tucked safely inside the booth. Jack Sullivan smiled back at her, dressed in his construction uniform, hard hat tucked under one arm. The photo had been taken just 3 weeks before the accident, before Hayes Development became a name that made her stomach twist with rage. "You should go inside, Mom. I'll close up." Emma nodded toward their small house visible just beyond the lot. They'd converted their front yard into the tree lot 5 years ago after the settlement money started running out. "You sure, honey? It's getting colder." "I'm sure. Go make some hot chocolate. I'll be right behind you." After her mother left, Emma sank onto the wooden stool and pulled out the letter she'd received that morning. The University of Michigan's architecture program. Rejected. Not because of her portfolio, the admissions counselor had called it promising, but because the partial scholarship they offered still left a gap she couldn't hope to fill. Another dream deferred because of Hayes Development. Emma carefully refolded the letter and tucked it into her coat pocket. No need to tell Mom yet. Not on Christmas Eve, when the lines around her eyes already deepened with worry about January's mortgage payment. Their modest home glowed warmly behind her. Inside were the Christmas decorations her father had loved, the mismatched ornaments collected over years, the ceramic nativity scene with the shepherd's crook her 5-year-old self had accidentally broken and Dad had carefully glued back together. Every corner held memories of Jack Sullivan, preserved as carefully as museum artifacts. The wind picked up, sending a swirl of snowflakes across the nearly empty lot. Emma checked her watch. 15 minutes until closing time. Then she could help Mom with Christmas Eve dinner, their scaled-down tradition of beef stew and apple pie instead of the elaborate feasts Dad used to prepare. Her second job at the diner started at 6 a.m. tomorrow, Christmas morning, but the holiday pay was too good to pass up. Between that and her weekend shifts at the bookstore, Emma had almost saved enough for next semester's community college tuition. Not the architectural program she dreamed of, but a step forward nonetheless, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, momentarily blinding her. Emma straightened, customer service smile automatically finding its place. Late shoppers were often desperate and willing to pay full price for even the most pitiful remaining trees. The luxury sedan that pulled up seemed out of place in their humble lot. Most of their customers drove practical family vehicles, not cars that cost more than their mortgage. Emma watched as a tall figure emerged, expensive coat collar turned up against the cold. Something about the man's confident stride triggered a memory. Emma had seen him before, not in person, but in the newspaper clippings she'd collected and studied over the years. The same clippings now filled a box under her bed, along with court transcripts and investigation reports she'd gathered during late nights at the public library. She slipped her hand into her other pocket, fingers brushing against the folded newspaper article she always carried. The headline was worn, but still legible. Hayes Development cleared in fatal construction accident. Below it, a smaller photo of Richard Hayes leaving the courthouse, expression impassive as three families prepared to bury their loved ones. Emma's heart pounded against her ribs as recognition crystallized. After 5 years of imagining this moment, Richard Hayes, the man whose company had robbed her of her father, had walked straight into her Christmas tree lot. The universe, it seemed, had finally delivered her a moment of reckoning. "I'll take this one," Richard said, gesturing toward the least pathetic of the remaining trees. He didn't bother with pleasantries or haggling, standard operating procedure for a man whose time was valued at thousands of dollars per hour. Emma stood frozen, her customer service smile abandoned. The newspaper clipping in her pocket seemed to burn against her thigh. 5 years of imagining this confrontation, and now words failed her. "How much?" Richard prompted, impatience edging his voice. $100, Emma replied automatically, charging double their usual price. A petty revenge, but it was all she had in the moment. Richard pulled out his wallet and handed over a crisp $100 bill without comment. The ease with which he parted with the money that would have helped with next month's heating bill, only fueled Emma's simmering anger. "I'll need help loading it," Richard said, already turning back toward his luxury sedan. "Mr. Hayes." Emma's voice was steadier than she expected. Richard paused, turning back with mild surprise. "Do I know you?" "No." Emma stepped forward, moving into the pool of light cast by the overhead bulbs. "But I know you." Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the slight narrowing of eyes that Emma had seen in corporate photos whenever Hayes Development announced another acquisition. "You're my father's killer." The words hung in the frigid air between them. Emma watched Richard's face, cataloguing every micro-expression, the momentary confusion, the dawning recognition, and finally, the practiced corporate mask sliding into place. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, voice cool and controlled. "I'll load the tree myself." Emma pulled the newspaper clipping from her pocket and unfolded it with trembling fingers. "Sullivan, Jack Sullivan. He worked construction for Pearson Builders, a subcontractor on your Westbrook project. 5 years ago, your company cut corners on safety inspections to meet deadline, and a crane collapsed." She held up the article. "You were cleared of criminal charges, but we all know money talks." Richard's eyes flickered to the clipping, but didn't take it. "I'm sorry for your loss, but Hayes Development was exonerated of any wrongdoing. The official investigation was a joke," Emma interrupted, her voice rising. "Your company had 3 safety violations that month alone. Dad told Mom about the rushed inspections. He was worried something would happen. Snow began falling more heavily around them, but neither moved." Richard's expression hardened into the same impassive mask he'd worn leaving the courthouse years ago. "Young lady, I understand you're upset, but I suggest you be careful about making unfounded accusations. Now I've paid for the tree, and I'll be on my way." He turned to leave, but Emma stepped into his path. "Unfounded? I have copies of the original safety reports before they were amended. I have testimonies from other workers who were too afraid of losing their jobs to speak up during the investigation." Richard's jaw tightened. "Where did you get those documents?" "Public records, newspaper archives, and 2 years of my life tracking down everyone who worked on that site." Emma held his gaze. "What did it cost you? The settlements, the legal fees, the PR campaign to save your company's reputation. Was it worth 3 lives?" For a brief moment, something flashed in Richard's eyes, something human beneath the corporate veneer, before it was quickly suppressed. "I don't have to listen to this." He moved toward his car. "Richard, Linda's voice came from behind them. She stood at the edge of the lot, concern etched on her face. "Emma, what's going on?" Emma's chest tightened. Her mother had never fully recovered from losing Dad. The grief had carved permanent lines around. Her eyes and mouth aged her beyond her years. "Mum, this is Richard Hayes, CEO of Hayes Development." Linda's face paled in the glow of the string lights. Unlike Emma's hot rage, Linda's grief had always been a quiet, dignified thing. "I see," she said softly. The three stood in tense silence as snow continued to fall, heavier now, the wind picking up. Richard glanced at his watch, then at the darkening sky. "There's a storm coming in," Linda said, her practical nature asserting itself despite the circumstances. "They're saying it'll be a bad one." A gust of wind confirmed her words, carrying a blast of snow that momentarily blinded them all. The wind howled with sudden ferocity, driving snow horizontally across the lot. Richard squinted against the icy particles stinging his face and turned toward his car, dignity momentarily forgotten in the face of nature's assault. "You won't make it far in that," Linda called after him, her voice barely audible above the wind. "They've already closed the highway. Radio said it's turning into a blizzard." Richard pulled out his phone, but the screen showed no service. Perfect. Trapped in a Christmas tree lot with a grieving family who held him personally responsible for their tragedy. If there was a God, he had a twisted sense of humor. "We have a shed," Linda continued, pointing to a weathered wooden structure at the back of the lot. "It's not much, but it's better than freezing in your car." Emma shot her mother an incredulous look. "Mom, you can't be serious." Linda's expression remained calm, though her eyes held a storm of their own. "We're not leaving anyone out in this weather, Emma. Your father wouldn't have." The mention of Jack Sullivan hung in the air between them. Richard stood awkwardly, weighing his options. His car's heater would only last until the gas ran out, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. "The shed it is, then," he conceded, with as much grace as he could muster. Emma led the way, shoulders stiff with resentment, while Linda secured the cash box from the booth. Richard followed, the expensive leather of his shoes already soaked through with snow. By the time they reached the shed, the world had disappeared behind a white veil, the lights from the house barely visible through the storm. The shed was small but solid, built by Jack Sullivan's own hands years ago. A kerosene heater sat in one corner, unlit. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding gardening tools, Christmas decorations, and the miscellaneous debris of family life. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows when Emma pulled the chain. "I'll get the heater going," Linda said, her practical nature taking over. "Emma, there are some blankets in that box." Richard stood just inside the door, feeling profoundly out of place among these remnants of a life he'd never known. A family life. His own childhood had been spent in sterile boarding schools and summer camps, his parents too busy building their fortune to be bothered with raising their son. "You can sit there," Emma said coldly, pointing to a wooden stool. She tossed him a worn blanket that smelled faintly of mothballs. Richard perched on the stool, looking distinctly uncomfortable. He pulled out his phone again, more out of habit than hope. "Still no signal." "Welcome to the real world," Emma muttered, "where things like reliable cell service aren't guaranteed." The heater sputtered to life under Linda's ministrations, gradually pushing back the cold with its orange glow. Outside, the wind continued its assault, occasionally shaking the entire structure. "How long is this supposed to last?" Richard asked, attempting to sound conversational rather than concerned. "Weather alert said until morning," Linda replied, settling herself on an overturned crate. "We've got water and some granola bars. We'll manage." An uncomfortable silence descended, broken only by the howl of wind and the occasional creak of the shed's timbers. Richard found himself studying Linda Sullivan's face. The same age as him, perhaps, but weathered by a different kind of life. Despite everything, she maintained a quiet dignity that made him inexplicably self-conscious. Emma sat as far from Richard as the small space allowed, her back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest. Her eyes never left him, watching with the intensity of someone memorizing an enemy's weaknesses. "I suppose we should introduce ourselves properly," Linda finally said, her tone neutral. "I'm Linda Sullivan. This is my daughter Emma." Richard cleared his throat. Richard Hayes. He almost added CEO of Hayes Development, his standard introduction, but stopped himself. They knew exactly who he was. "Did you know their names?" Emma asked suddenly. "The men who died, did you ever learn their names, or were they just numbers in a settlement?" "Emma," Linda warned softly. "No, it's a fair question," Richard said. Surprising himself, he looked directly at Emma. "Yes, I knew their names. Jack Sullivan, Miguel Ortiz, and David Chen." Emma's eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting this answer. "I read every report," Richard continued, his voice measured. "I signed every settlement check. I approved the memorial plaque at the site." "A plaque?" Emma scoffed. "How generous." Outside, a particularly violent gust rattled the shed's door, as if nature itself was punctuating Emma's scorn. The single light bulb swayed, sending shadows dancing across their faces. The kerosene heater cast long shadows across the shed's wooden walls as the storm raged outside. Richard shifted uncomfortably on his stool, the silence between them heavier than the snow piling against the door. Linda reached absently toward a shelf, her fingers brushing against a pair of worn work gloves. She picked them up, a small smile touching her lips before fading into sadness. "Jack built this shed the summer before Emma turned 10, she said quietly, almost to herself. Insisted on doing it all himself, even when our neighbor offered to. Help, said a man should be able to build something that lasts." Richard watched her hands caress the cracked leather of the gloves. They were construction gloves, heavy duty, with the initials JS written in faded marker on the cuff. "He wore these every day," Linda continued. "Said you could tell a good worker by how worn his gloves were. These were his third pair that year." Emma's posture softened slightly, her eyes fixed on the gloves in her mother's hands. "He used to let me try them on. They went all the way up to my elbows." "Jack was with Pearson Builders for 15 years, Linda said, looking directly at Richard now. "Started as a laborer right out of high school, worked his way up to foreman. He was proud of never missing a day's work, even when he had pneumonia one winter." Richard nodded, unsure what response was expected of him. In his world, construction workers were interchangeable assets, necessary components in the machinery of progress, but rarely considered as individuals with families, with histories. "He called me 2 days before the accident," Linda said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "He was worried about the inspection schedules being rushed, said the concrete hadn't properly cured, but they were being pressured to move forward to meet the deadline." Emma stood abruptly, moving to the small window now frosted with ice. "He tried to tell them, filed a formal complaint with his supervisor." She turned to face Richard. "Did that report ever make it to your desk, Mr. Hayes?" Richard's mind raced through the thousands of documents that crossed his desk during that period. Had there been a safety concern from a foreman? Would he have even noticed it among the profit projections and shareholder reports? "I don't recall seeing it," he admitted. "Those reports typically go through several departments before reaching executive level." "Convenient," Emma muttered. Linda placed the gloves carefully back on the shelf. "Jack was a careful man, methodical. He taught all his crews to double-check everything. Measure twice, cut once, he always said." She paused, collecting herself. "That's why I never believed it." When they said it was worker error, Richard had rehearsed the company's defense countless times with his legal team. The official investigation found that a series of procedural errors by the workers, combined with unexpected material failure, had caused the accident. Hayes Development had followed all required protocols. The settlements were offered as a gesture of goodwill, not an admission of guilt, but sitting here, facing Jack Sullivan's widow and daughter, those carefully crafted explanations felt hollow. The morning of the accident, Linda continued, he kissed me goodbye like always, said he'd pick up steaks for dinner to celebrate Emma's science fair win. Her voice caught slightly. He made it a point to be at every school event, every recital. Not many construction foremen could say that. Emma returned to her seat, eyes glistening. Dad used to test me on building terms. By 12, I could explain the difference between load-bearing and non-load-bearing walls. A reluctant smile crossed her face. He'd bring home blueprints sometimes, show me how to read them. That's when I knew I wanted to be an architect. Richard found himself imagining Jack Sullivan, a man who built things with his hands, who taught his daughter about blueprints, who worried about proper curing times for concrete. A real person, not a line item in a settlement agreement. He sounds like a good man, Richard said quietly. The best, Emma replied without hesitation. Linda nodded toward a corner of the shed where garden tools stood neatly arranged. He organized everything, had a system, said you could tell the quality of a worker by how they treated their tools. She looked directly at Richard. He wasn't careless, Mr. Hayes. None of those men were. The implication hung heavy in the air. If the men weren't careless, then where did the responsibility lie? The shed creaked under a heavy gust of wind, the storm showing no signs of abating. Richard pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Emma's eyes narrowed as she studied Richard's face in the flickering light. After a moment of deliberation, she stood and moved to a cardboard box tucked beneath one of the shelves. She pulled it out and placed it between them on the floor. I've been collecting these for 5 years, she said, removing the lid. Inside were dozens of neatly organized folders, newspaper clippings, and printed documents. Every article, every public record, every leaked memo I could find about the Westbrook project and the investigation that followed. Richard stiffened. Leaked memos? Emma extracted a folder and opened it, revealing a stack of papers protected in plastic sleeves. She selected one and handed it to him. Safety inspection report dated 2 weeks before the collapse. Notice anything interesting? Richard recognized the document immediately, the standard form used by Hayes Development's safety compliance team. His eyes scanned the page, landing on the signature at the bottom. His own. This appears to be an order, he said, cautiously. All safety protocols were followed according to... Now look at this one, Emma interrupted, handing him another document. Same inspection, different report. This version was buried in the court records. I spent 3 days at the county clerk's office finding it. The second report contained numerous red flags, structural concerns, insufficient support bracing, accelerated timelines. Yet it too bore his signature, identical to the first. Richard's mouth went dry. Where did you get this? Public records aren't as well sealed as Hayes Development might hope, Emma replied, especially when the clerk's son was in my high school class and owed me a favor. Linda watched silently, her face unreadable as her daughter laid out the evidence she had been gathering since she was 13 years old. This inspection was performed by Thomas Weldon, Emma continued, pointing to a name on the report. Your CFO, correct? Interesting choice to oversee safety protocols. Richard remembered the conversation with Tom. The project was behind schedule, investors were getting nervous, and the winter weather was causing delays. Tom had suggested streamlining the inspection process just this once to keep things moving. Richard had agreed without giving it much thought, trusting his executives to handle the details. The original report identified 7 major safety concerns, Emma said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. All of them magically disappeared in the version submitted to investigators after the accident. She continued pulling documents from her collection, emails between executives discussing the cost of delays versus the cost of potential lawsuits, handwritten notes from meetings where the decision to proceed had been made, newspaper articles quoting Richard's prepared statement expressing regret while denying responsibility. Your legal team was thorough, Emma acknowledged. They created a perfect paper trail, showing Hayes Development had done everything by the book. But they missed a few things. She produced another document, this one a handwritten letter. Miguel Ortiz wrote this to his supervisor the day before the accident. His wife gave me a copy. She handed it to Richard. He identified the exact failure point that would eventually collapse. No one responded to his concerns. Richard scanned the letter, written in careful, precise handwriting. Miguel had noted unusual movement in one of the support structures, requesting additional bracing before proceeding with the next phase. According to the timestamp, the letter had been received and filed, but no action had been taken. The official investigation concluded it was worker error, Emma said bitterly. 3 men who had decades of construction experience between them, somehow all made the same critical mistake simultaneously. Richard carefully returned the documents to Emma, his corporate armor beginning to crack under the weight of the evidence. He had never directly falsified reports, had never needed to. His executives handled such details, ensuring his hands stayed clean while his signature authorized everything. I'm not a fool, Mr. Hayes, Emma said quietly. I know how corporate America works, plausible deniability, layers of management between decisions and consequences. You probably never even visited the site. She was right. Richard had flown over the Westbrook development in his helicopter once, noting with satisfaction how the project was transforming an underutilized area into prime real estate. He had never walked the grounds, never spoken to the foreman or workers. Building his vision, Linda, who had remained silent throughout Emma's presentation, finally spoke. We're not asking for more money, Mr. Hayes. The settlement is done. But we've lived 5 years with the official story that Jack was somehow responsible for his own death. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected years of contained pain. That's harder to bear than losing him. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the shed's windows. Inside, the only sound was the soft hiss of the kerosene heater as Richard Hayes confronted a truth he had paid millions to. Bury. Richard stared at the documents spread before him, each page an indictment of decisions made and responsibilities abdicated. His carefully constructed world of plausible deniability was crumbling under the weight of a teenager's 5-year quest for truth. He began, then stopped. What could he say? That he never intended for anyone to die, that he never personally falsified reports, that he never thought his decisions would lead to this moment, trapped in a shed on Christmas Eve with the human cost of his corporate ambition. You never what? Emma pressed, her voice tight with barely contained emotion. Never bothered to check if corners were being cut? Never considered that rushing deadlines might have consequences? Never thought you'd have to face one of the families your company destroyed? Richard reached into his coat pocket and withdrew his wallet. From its leather depths he pulled a small embossed card, gold lettering on heavy cream stock. He placed it on top of Emma's documents. Developer of the Year, Emma read aloud, her voice hollow, presented to Richard Hayes, CEO of Hayes Development, for outstanding contribution to urban renewal. She looked up, eyes burning. When was this awarded? March 15th, Richard said quietly. 1 month after the accident. Emma's laugh was bitter. So while we were planning Dad's funeral, you were accepting awards. I almost didn't attend the ceremony, Richard admitted. The accident was still in the news. My PR team thought it would look better if I went. Showed that Hayes Development was moving forward, that we weren't defined by one unfortunate incident. Unfortunate incident, Linda echoed, the first hint of anger breaking through her composed exterior. Is that what you call 3 deaths? An unfortunate incident? Richard met her gaze, then looked away, unable to bear the quiet dignity of her grief. That was the language our legal team advised us to use: clinical, detached, nothing that could be construed as an admission of liability. He ran a hand through his silver hair, disheveled now, after hours in the shed. There's a playbook for these situations. The company's worth, stockholder interests, insurance considerations, all of it depends on containing the damage. I followed the playbook, while real people suffered the consequences, Emma said. Richard nodded slowly, the admission more painful than he'd expected. Yes. The simple acknowledgement hung in the air between them. No corporate speak, no carefully worded statement crafted by a team of lawyers, just the truth, unvarnished and damning. We were under enormous pressure, he continued, the words coming more freely now. The Westbrook development was behind schedule. Investors were threatening to pull out. The city council was questioning whether we could deliver on our promises. He shook his head. Tom, my CFO, suggested we could streamline some of the processes, just temporarily, just to get back on schedule. Streamline, Emma repeated. Nice euphemism for ignoring safety concerns. I never explicitly authorized. Falsifying reports, Richard said, though the defense sounded weak even to his own ears. But I made it clear that delays were unacceptable. I created the pressure that pushed everyone to cut corners. He looked up at Linda. I never visited the site, never met the workers, never saw the faces of the men building my vision. They were just numbers on a payroll, line items in a budget. The silence that followed was broken only by the howl of the wind outside and the soft hiss of the kerosene heater. In that moment, Richard Hayes, who had faced down hostile takeovers and weathered economic downturns, found himself unable to meet the gaze of a woman whose life he had irrevocably altered. After it happened, he continued, his voice lower. Now, I couldn't sleep. For weeks, I'd wake up at 3 a.m. thinking about those men, about their families. He glanced at the award card still lying atop Emma's documents. But then there were board meetings and investor calls and media statements, and gradually the sleepless nights became less frequent. Life moved on, at least mine did. Ours didn't have that luxury, Linda said softly. Richard nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. No, I imagine it didn't. Emma studied him, searching for any sign of performance or calculation in his confession. Finding none, she asked, do you regret it? Truly regret it? Or do you just regret getting caught? Richard considered the question carefully. In his world, contrition was a strategic move, deployed when necessary to manage public perception. But here, in this shed, with the storm raging outside and nowhere to hide, strategy seemed pointless. I regret creating a company culture where meeting deadlines mattered more than human lives, he said finally. I regret signing documents without reading them because I was too busy to be bothered with details. I regret that it took sitting across from you and your mother to fully understand what my decisions cost. As if punctuating his confession, the shed single light bulb flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging them into darkness save for the orange glow of the kerosene heater. The sudden darkness pulled them from the weight of confession into the immediate present. Linda's practical nature took over as she rose and felt her way along the shelves. There should be an old kerosene lamp somewhere here, she murmured. Jack always kept one for emergencies. Emma pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to help her mother search. The beam caught the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating Linda's determined profile as she carefully moved items aside. Here it is, Linda said finally, lifting an old brass lamp from behind a stack of gardening pots. Let me just check if it has fuel. Richard watched silently as Linda expertly checked the lamp's reservoir, filled it from the same kerosene container that fed their heater, and trimmed the wick. Within moments, a warm, golden light bloomed in the darkness, casting long shadows. Across the shed's wooden walls, the lamp's glow seemed to soften the sharp edges of their confrontation, creating a small island of warmth against the storm raging outside. Linda placed it carefully on an upturned crate between them, the flame dancing with each gust of wind that found its way through the shed's imperfect seams. "Jack loved Christmas," she said suddenly, settling back onto her seat. "He'd start planning his decorations in October. Used to drive me crazy, pulling out all those boxes before Halloween was even over." A small smile touched Emma's lips. "Remember the year he decided to build that wooden sleigh for the front yard? Worked on it every weekend for a month. And it was too heavy to move once he finished it." Linda laughed softly. "We had to get 3 neighbors to help drag it into position." Richard found himself drawn into their reminiscence, seeing glimpses of a life built on small joys and shared memories rather than quarterly profits and shareholder value. "What about you, Mr. Hayes?" Linda asked, surprising him. "Any Christmas traditions in your family?" The question caught Richard off guard. His Christmases for the past decade had been solitary affairs, expensive gifts sent to distant relatives, perhaps a call to his sister in London, a catered dinner eaten alone in his penthouse while the city celebrated below. "Not really," he admitted. "Not anymore." Something in his tone made Linda study him more carefully. "And before, when you were young?" Richard hesitated, unused to sharing personal details. In his world, personal history was carefully curated for authorized biographies and magazine profiles, not shared with strangers in a garden shed. "My parents were busy," he said finally, "building their real estate empire. I was usually at boarding school, even during the holidays. There was a tree in the main hall, the headmaster dressed as Santa on Christmas morning." The stark contrast between his childhood recollections and the Sullivan family traditions hung in the air. Emma's hostility seemed to soften fractionally as she registered the emptiness behind his words. "That sounds lonely," Linda observed without judgment. Richard shrugged. "It taught me self-reliance, made me who I am." "And who is that exactly?" Emma asked, the question gentler than her earlier accusations. Before Richard could formulate a response, Linda reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small thermos. "I almost forgot I had this," she said, unscrewing the cap. The rich aroma of hot chocolate filled the small space. "It's not much, but I always bring some when we're selling trees. The cold gets into your bones after a while." She poured a small amount into the cup that formed the thermos lid and handed it to Emma, who took a sip before passing it to Richard. He stared at the offered cup for a moment, caught off guard by the simple gesture of inclusion. "Thank you," he said, accepting it carefully. The chocolate was still warm, rich with a hint of cinnamon. It reminded him suddenly, vividly, of a Christmas market his nanny had taken him to as a child, before boarding school, before his parents' ambitions had fully eclipsed their family life. "My mother used to make hot chocolate on Christmas Eve," he found himself saying, "with cinnamon sticks. I couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. She'd let me stir it and said it was magic because it kept Santa warm on his journey." The memory had been buried so deep he hadn't thought of it in decades. Something about the lamplight, the howling storm outside, and the simple act of sharing a drink had excavated it from beneath years of corporate strategy meetings and development deals. "What happened to that little boy?" Linda asked softly. "The one who believed in Santa and magic hot chocolate?" Richard looked down at the small cup in his hands, seeing his reflection distorted in the dark liquid. "I suppose he grew up, learned how the world really works." "And how does it work, Mr. Hayes?" Linda pressed gently. Richard met her gaze across the lamplight. "Until tonight, I would have said it works on profit margins and calculated risks, acceptable losses and forward momentum." "And now?" Emma asked. Richard handed the cup back to Linda. "Now, I'm not so sure." Emma reached back into her box of collected documents and extracted a thick manila folder. Her fingers hesitated on the label before she opened it and removed a stapled set of papers. Even in the lamplight, The Hayes Development letterhead was unmistakable at the top of the first page. "This is the settlement offer your legal team sent us," she said, placing it carefully on the crate between them. $250,000, contingent upon signing a non-disclosure agreement and waiving all rights to future claims. Richard recognized the document, the standard settlement package his legal department had crafted for all three families. He remembered approving the amount, accepting his general counsel's assurance that it was generous given the circumstances and more than adequate to address the family's needs while protecting the company's interests. Linda looked at the document without touching it. The hospital bills for Jack's 3 days in intensive care before he died came to almost $80,000. After that, there was the funeral, the mortgage. Her voice remained steady, factual rather than accusatory. $250,000 doesn't go as far as your lawyers might think, Mr. Hayes. They calculated it based on projected lifetime earnings, Richard said, the corporate explanation surfacing automatically. Adjusted for inflation and... He stopped, hearing how cold and impersonal it sounded. "I'm sorry. That's not... that was the reasoning." Emma's laugh held no humor. "They put a price tag on my dad's life, as if his value could be calculated based on his salary." She pulled out another document. "And this non-disclosure agreement effectively silenced us. We couldn't speak to reporters, couldn't post on social media, couldn't even tell our friends the truth about what happened." Richard had signed off on the NDAs without giving them much thought. Standard procedure to protect the company from negative publicity. He'd never considered how they might silence grieving families, stripping them of even the comfort of sharing their truth. "We almost didn't sign," Linda admitted. "Jack would have wanted us to fight to make sure the truth came out, but Emma was 13. I had no job, mounting medical bills, and a mortgage payment due. Your lawyers made it very clear the offer was time-sensitive." Emma opened another folder. "I was too young to understand what was happening then, but I started collecting evidence anyway. News articles, court records, anything I could find about Hayes' development and the accident." She looked up at Richard. "I was planning to go public when I turned 18, NDA or not. That would have exposed you to significant legal liability," Richard said, his tone cautionary rather than threatening. "I know. But some things matter more than money, Mr. Hayes." Emma's gaze was steady, like clearing my father's name. Richard thought about the resources at his disposal, the team of high-powered attorneys who would have descended upon this young woman with the full force of corporate litigation, crushing her attempt at truth-telling with injunctions and countersuits. The imbalance of power was stark and disturbing. "What stopped you?" he asked. "Mom got sick last year, needed surgery." Emma glanced at her mother, who looked away. "Insurance wouldn't cover all of it. I had to choose between exposing Hayes' development and making sure Mom got the care she needed." Linda reached over to touch her daughter's hand. "Emma's been working 2 jobs while finishing high school. She's put her whole life on hold because of me." "Because of Hayes' development," Emma corrected gently. "Because the settlement money ran out, and we're still paying the price for your company's negligence." Richard thought of the millions his company had spent on legal fees and PR consultants to manage the fallout from the accident, far more than they'd paid to the families of the victims. The cost of protecting the Hayes Development brand had apparently taken precedence over truly making amends to those harmed. "Did any of the other families challenge the settlement?" he asked. "Miguel's widow tried," Emma said. "She gave interviews to a local reporter, talking about his safety concerns before the accident. Your legal team sent her a cease and desist letter threatening to sue for violating the NDA and demanding return of the settlement money." She shook her head. "She has 4 children. She couldn't risk it." Richard closed his eyes briefly, imagining the scene. A grieving widow with 4 children receiving a threatening letter bearing his company's letterhead. He hadn't known about that specific action, but he had established the policies that made it possible. had created a corporate culture where protecting the company's interests justified almost any tactic. "I never thought about what happened after the settlements," he admitted. "In my mind, the situation was resolved. We'd compensated. The families implemented new safety protocols, moved on to the next project." "Moved on," Linda repeated softly. "That's a luxury grief doesn't allow." Outside, the wind seemed to be subsiding slightly, though snow still fell heavily. The lamp's flame flickered steadily, illuminating the faces of 3 people whose lives had been irrevocably connected by tragedy and were now being further entwined by chance, or perhaps something more than chance. Linda adjusted the lamp's flame, casting a slightly brighter glow throughout the shed. The storm had settled into a steady snowfall, no longer battering the walls with the same fury, but still imprisoning them in their temporary shelter. "It's getting late," she observed, checking her watch. "We should try to get some rest. No telling how long we'll be here." Emma nodded and reached for her backpack, pulling it closer to use as a makeshift pillow. As she did, a large envelope slipped out, its contents partially spilling onto the floor. Richard glimpsed what appeared to be architectural drawings before Emma hurriedly gathered them up. "Are those yours?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Emma hesitated, clearly reluctant to share something so personal with him. Finally, she nodded. "Just some sketches, nothing important." Linda gave her daughter an encouraging look. Emma was accepted to 3 architecture programs last spring. Full portfolio review, everything. Pride mixed with sorrow in Linda's voice, and Richard understood there was more to the story. Emma's tight expression confirmed it. "May I?" Richard gestured toward the drawings, surprising himself with his interest. After a moment's consideration, Emma handed him one of the sheets. It was a detailed rendering of a community center, the perspective drawing showing clean, modern lines while incorporating natural elements. A living green roof, large windows positioned to maximize natural light, outdoor spaces that flowed seamlessly into indoor ones. "This is impressive," Richard said, studying the technical aspects of the drawing. "You've considered solar orientation, traffic flow, community integration." He looked up at her. "This isn't amateur work." Emma shrugged, but he could see his assessment pleased her despite her efforts to remain indifferent. "Dad used to bring home blueprints. I've been studying them since I was a kid." Richard examined the other drawings she reluctantly shared, residential spaces designed for maximum efficiency without sacrificing beauty, a small urban park that transformed an abandoned lot into a community gathering space, preliminary sketches for a sustainable housing development. "These show real talent," he said, the developer in him recognizing potential. "Which programs accepted you?" Emma's expression clouded. "University of Michigan, Cornell, and Rhode Island School of Design." "All excellent schools," Richard noted. "So which did you choose?" Linda and Emma exchanged a look heavy with shared disappointment. "I didn't go," Emma said flatly. "Couldn't afford it, even with partial scholarships." Richard frowned. "But the settlement was gone," Linda finished quietly. "Between the medical bills, the mortgage, and basic living expenses after I had to cut back my hours at the hospital." She trailed off, not needing to elaborate further. Emma pulled another envelope from her backpack and handed it to Richard. It was a rejection letter from the University of Michigan's financial aid office, dated just that morning. "I applied again. And for next fall," she explained. "Even with working 2 jobs, I couldn't save enough. The scholarships cover about half, but that still leaves $20,000 a year I don't have." Richard read the letter, noting the admissions officer's genuine regret at being unable to offer additional aid, despite acknowledging Emma's exceptional portfolio and academic achievements. Another casualty of the accident that had never appeared on any corporate balance sheet, a young woman's derailed dreams. "What's your backup plan?" he asked. "Community college for now. I'm taking basic courses, working at the diner and the bookstore." Emma reclaimed her drawings, carefully returning them to the envelope. Maybe in a few years I can transfer somewhere. If Mum's health holds up, if we can keep the house. Richard thought about his own educational path, the prestigious private schools, the Ivy League education, all paid for without question by parents determined to secure their son's future. He'd never had to choose between his dreams and survival, had never known what it meant to set aside ambition due to financial constraints. Your father would be proud, Linda said softly to Emma. He always said you had an eye for structure, even when you were little. Remember how you used to correct his measurements when he was building that treehouse? A reluctant smile touched Emma's lips. He'd pretend to make mistakes just so I could catch them. He knew you'd be something special one day, Linda continued. An architect who understood buildings from the ground up, not just from blueprints. Richard watched the interplay between mother and daughter, the shared memories, the gentle encouragement, the love that had sustained them through tragedy. It was so different from his own family dynamics, where achievements were expected rather than celebrated, where emotional connections took a distant second place to professional success. "What kind of architect do you want to be?" he asked Emma, genuinely interested. She seemed surprised by the question, perhaps even by his interest. After a moment's consideration, she answered, "I want to design spaces that matter. Affordable housing that's actually beautiful and functional. Community, buildings that bring people together instead of just checking boxes." "Not luxury condos and corporate headquarters?" Richard asked with a hint of self-deprecation. Emma's gaze was direct. "Not everyone can afford a Hayes development property, Mr. Hayes. Some of us have to live in the real world." The gentle rebuke landed with more force than her earlier accusations. Richard looked down at the rejection letter still in his hand, a single sheet of paper that represented a dream deferred, another ripple effect from decisions made in boardrooms far removed from their human consequences. The kerosene lamp cast long shadows as silence settled over the shed. Linda had dozed off, her head resting against a stack of folded tarps. Emma remained awake, absently sketching in a small notebook, occasionally glancing at Richard with a mixture of lingering resentment and reluctant curiosity. Richard pulled out his phone, not to check for a signal but to scroll through his photo gallery, something he rarely did. Past the professional photographs from corporate events and property openings were older images, digital artifacts of a life lived in pursuit of success. He paused on a photo from 15 years earlier, himself standing beside his parents at the opening of the first major Hayes development project. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, but their bodies were angled away from each other, the physical distance between them reflecting a deeper emotional gap. "Your family?" Emma asked. Noticing his focus on the screen, Richard nodded. "My parents. This was at the Riverside Plaza opening. The project that put Hayes Development on the map." "You look like your father," Emma observed. "In more ways than I care to admit," Richard replied, surprising himself with the candor. He scrolled to another photo, a Christmas gathering at his sister's home in London, 3 years ago. He stood awkwardly beside the elaborately decorated tree, holding a glass of champagne, smiling politely, while his nieces and nephews opened presents in the foreground. "Last time I attended a family Christmas," he explained, though Emma hadn't asked. "My sister invites me every year. I usually send gifts, but don't go myself. Always too busy with year-end reports and Q1 projections." "That's sad," Emma said simply, without the judgment he might have expected. Richard swiped again, revealing a woman in her early 40s, beautiful in an understated way, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. "Catherine," he said quietly. "My ex-wife." "What happened?" Emma asked, then caught herself. "Sorry, none of my business." "No, it's—" Richard considered deflecting the question, but found himself wanting to answer. "Hayes Development happened. 80-hour work weeks happened. Prioritizing business dinners over anniversary celebrations happened." He closed the photo gallery. "She said she felt like she was married to the company, not to me. She wasn't wrong." Emma studied him with a directness that reminded him of her. Father's letter, precise, unflinching assessment. Was it worth it, all the sacrifices? Richard had been asked this question in countless interviews over the years. His standard response was polished and immediate. Of course it was worth it. Hayes' development had transformed urban landscapes, created jobs, generated wealth. Success required sacrifice. But sitting in this shed, confronted by the human cost of his corporate ambition, that rehearsed answer felt hollow. "I don't know anymore," he admitted, the truth of it surprising him. "I built exactly what I set out to build, a company that would outlast me, a legacy of steel and glass. But somewhere along the way, I became what I once despised." "What do?" "You mean?" Emma asked. Richard set his phone aside. "My father was a difficult man, brilliant developer, terrible parent, always working, always pushing for the next big deal. My childhood memories all have the same background noise. My father on the phone, making deals while missing school plays and baseball games." He shook his head at the irony. "I swore I'd never be like him. Then I found myself cancelling dinner with Catherine to close an acquisition, rescheduling vacations because of board meetings. Eventually, she stopped expecting me to show up at all." Emma's expression softened slightly. Not forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. "So you became him anyway." "And then some," Richard acknowledged. "At least my father built a family alongside his company, however imperfectly. I couldn't even manage that." He thought of his empty penthouse waiting across town, the designer furniture selected by an interior decorator, the kitchen he never used, the spaces devoid of the personal touches that made the Sullivans' modest home feel so alive despite their struggles. "The thing is," he continued, "I never questioned it until recently. The path seemed clear. Sacrifice personal connections for professional success. That's what ambitious people do, right? But lately—" He trailed off, searching for words. "Lately?" "What?" Emma prompted. "Lately, I've been waking up at 3 a.m. again, not thinking about those men who died, but about what I've become. About sitting alone in that penthouse on Christmas Eve, decorating a tree no one else will see." He met Emma's gaze. "About what the point of it all is, if there's no one to share it with." Emma closed her sketchbook, considering his words. "My dad used to say that you can tell what matters to a person by looking at where they spend their time, not their money." The simple wisdom landed with unexpected force. Richard had spent decades building wealth, property, corporate influence, but had invested almost nothing in the relationships that might have given that success meaning. "Your father sounds like a wise man," Richard said quietly. "He was," Emma agreed, a flash of grief crossing her features. "He really was." Outside, the snow continued to fall silently, blanketing the world in white. Inside, Richard Hayes confronted the growing realization that his carefully constructed life might be impressive from a distance, but felt increasingly empty up close. Richard awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. His neck protested the awkward angle it had maintained through the night as he dozed against the shed wall. Pale light filtered through the frosted window, casting the interior in a soft, ethereal glow. "You're awake," Linda observed quietly. She sat on her crate, the kerosene lamp extinguished beside her. "Merry Christmas." Christmas. Richard had almost forgotten. In his world, December 25th was simply another day, distinguished only by empty streets and closed offices. But here, even in this humble shed, the word carried weight. "What time is it?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Just past 7, Linda replied. The storms let up, Emma's outside checking the damage. As if summoned by her name, the shed door swung open, admitting a blast of cold air and Emma's bundled figure. Snowflakes clung to her woolen hat and the shoulders of her coat. "It's beautiful out there," she announced, stomping snow from her boots. "Everything's covered in ice. The sunrise is hitting it just right. The whole world looks like it's made of crystal." Richard stood stiffly, his designer clothes rumpled and inadequate against the cold. He moved to the small window and wiped away the frost with his sleeve. The scene outside was indeed transformed. Every branch, every surface was encased in ice that caught the morning light, refracting it into countless miniature rainbows. The devastation of the storm had created something unexpectedly magnificent. The road should be passable in a few hours, Emma continued, her breath visible in the cold air. The plows are already working on the main streets. The news should have brought relief. Soon, Richard could return to his ordered, predictable life, away from uncomfortable truths and painful reflections. Instead, he felt a strange reluctance, as if leaving this shed meant abandoning something important, something unfinished. "I should check on the house," Linda said, wrapping her scarf more tightly around her neck. "Make sure we didn't lose power." "There too. I'll come with you," Emma offered. Linda paused at the door, looking back at Richard. "You're welcome to join us, Mr. Hayes. It's warmer in the house, and I imagine you could use some coffee." The invitation surprised him. After everything that had been said, after the revelations of the night, Linda Sullivan was extending hospitality to the man whose company had upended her life. The simple generosity of it left him momentarily speechless. "Thank you," he managed finally. "I'd appreciate that." They made their way carefully across the ice-covered lot, their breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. The Christmas trees that hadn't sold stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with ice and snow. Richard's expensive shoes slipped on the treacherous surface, and he found himself gripping Emma's reluctantly offered arm for balance. The silence between them was different now, not comfortable certainly, but no longer charged with the same hostility. Something had shifted during the long night of confessions and shared memories, a subtle realignment of understanding, if not forgiveness. They reached the back door of the Sullivan home, and Linda led them into a small, warm kitchen. The power was still on here, and a coffee maker gurgled welcomingly on the counter. The room was modest but inviting, dish towels embroidered with Christmas motifs, a small table with 3 mismatched chairs, family photos magnetized to the refrigerator. "Door, make yourself at home," Linda said, removing her coat. "I'll get breakfast started." Richard stood awkwardly in the center of the kitchen, feeling profoundly out of place. His gaze caught on a wall calendar where December 25th was circled in red with Emma Diner 6 a.m., written in careful script and then crossed out. A small note beside it read, "Called in storm." "You were supposed to work today?" he asked Emma. She nodded, filling 3 mugs with coffee. "Holiday pay is time and a half, but the roads won't be clear enough by 6. And honestly, after a night in the shed," she shrugged, "I'll make it up next weekend." Richard accepted the mug she offered, the ceramic warm against his cold fingers. The simple domesticity of the moment, standing in a kitchen on Christmas morning, drinking coffee after a shared ordeal, felt foreign yet somehow right. Through the window above the sink, he could see the transformed landscape, beautiful in its frozen stillness. The rising sun caught the icicles hanging from the eaves, turning them into prisms that scattered light across the snow-covered yard. Nature's own Christmas decorations, more stunning than any professionally designed holiday display he'd commissioned for his corporate headquarters. "I should call my driver," Richard said, more out of habit than actual desire to leave. "Once the roads are clear." Linda nodded, cracking eggs into a bowl. "Of course, but there's no rush. It's Christmas morning after all." Christmas morning. When was the last time those words had held any special meaning for Richard Hayes? He couldn't remember, but standing in this warm kitchen with its smell of coffee and promise of shared breakfast, he felt something long dormant stirring to life. A recognition that perhaps there were forms of wealth he had never properly valued. After a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, Emma disappeared upstairs to shower and change. Linda refilled Richard's coffee cup and gestured toward the adjoining living room. "We can wait in there. It's more comfortable," Richard followed. her through the doorway and stopped, momentarily taken aback. Unlike the rest of the modest home, the living room was transformed by Christmas decorations, not the coordinated professional displays he was accustomed to in hotel lobbies and corporate offices, but a collection of clearly cherished items, accumulated over decades. A small artificial tree stood in the corner, draped with multicolored lights and an eclectic assortment of ornaments. No designer theme, no color scheme, just a lifetime of memories hanging from branches too sparse to properly support them. "It's not much compared to what you're probably used to," Linda said, misinterpreting his pause. "No, it's—" Richard searched for the right word. "It's personal. That's something money can't buy." Linda's expression softened. Jack loved decorating the tree. Each ornament had to be in just the right spot. Emma used to tease him about it. She moved to the tree and carefully lifted a small ceramic star, crudely painted in a child's hand. Emma made this in second grade. Jack hung it front and center. Every year, even when she got older and was embarrassed by it, Richard approached slowly, feeling like an intruder in this intimate space. Each ornament seemed to tell a story. A tiny silver ballet slipper, a miniature construction worker's hard hat, a faded photo of a younger Linda and Jack in a frame decorated with the word, "First Christmas." This was our tradition on Christmas. "Morning," Linda explained, touching a delicate glass bird. "After presents, we'd each choose our favorite ornament and tell its story again, even though we all knew them by heart." Richard thought of his own Christmas tree, still tied to the roof of his car outside, an expensive, perfectly shaped pine selected primarily for its aesthetic appeal, to be decorated with color-coordinated ornaments purchased by his assistant. No stories, no history, no meaning beyond creating the appropriate seasonal atmosphere. His gaze traveled around the room, taking in other touches of the Sullivan family history. Framed photographs on the mantel, a hand-knitted stocking hanging. From a hook, a nativity scene carved from wood with obvious care and skill. "Did Jack make that?" he asked, nodding toward the nativity. Linda nodded. "The Christmas before Emma was born. He was so nervous about becoming a father that he needed something to keep his hands busy. Spent weeks working on it, getting every detail just right." Richard moved closer to examine the craftsmanship. The figures were simple but expressive, each face conveying emotion despite the limitations of the medium. It was clearly the work of someone who understood materials, who knew how to coax beauty from raw elements, a builder in the truest sense. "He was talented," Richard observed. "He was," Linda agreed. "Not just with his hands, but with people too. He had a way of making everyone feel valued, no matter their position." She paused, meeting Richard's gaze directly. That's why his crews were so loyal, why they trusted him when he raised safety concerns. The subtle reminder of why they were here, of the tragedy that connected them, hung in the air. Richard nodded, accepting it without defense. His attention was drawn to a small table near the window, where a single framed photograph stood apart from the others. Jack Sullivan in his construction gear, standing tall against a backdrop of steel beams, his face creased in a smile beneath his hard hat. With a jolt, Richard recognized the setting, the Westbrook development, likely taken weeks before the accident. That was his last project, Linda confirmed, following his gaze. He was proud of it despite his concerns, said it would change the skyline, make a difference in the city. Richard remembered the marketing materials for the Westbrook development, the glossy renderings, the promises of urban renewal and economic growth. Not once in all the planning meetings and progress reports had he considered the pride of the men and women actually building his vision, their personal investment in creating something lasting. He was right, Richard said quietly. It did change. The skyline. People notice it every day. Emma appeared in the doorway, hair damp from her shower, dressed in fresh clothes. Her eyes moved from Richard to the photograph of her father, and something complicated passed across her features. Mom keeps it there so he can see the sunrise, she explained, her voice softer than it had been in the shed. Dad always said the best part of construction work was watching the sun come up over the city while everyone else was still asleep. Richard nodded, unable to find adequate words. In all his years developing properties across the city, he'd never once been on site at sunrise, had never witnessed the daily ritual of men like Jack Sullivan as they built the structures that defined his legacy. The Christmas tree lights twinkled softly, reflecting off the ornaments that each held a memory, a piece of family history. Richard's gaze moved from these humble treasures to the photograph of Jack Sullivan, a man who understood that true legacy wasn't measured in square footage or property values, but in the lives touched and the memories created. "Your home is beautiful," Richard said simply, meaning it in a way he never had when complimenting million-dollar penthouses or executive mansions. Richard's phone chimed with a message. Service had been restored. The outside world, momentarily suspended during the storm, now beckoned him back. 3 missed calls from his assistant, a dozen emails flagged urgent, calendar notifications for meetings he'd already missed. "Roads are being cleared," he announced, reading a traffic alert. "Should be passable within the hour." Linda nodded, a certain resignation in her expression. The temporary bubble created by the storm was dissolving, reality reasserting itself. Soon, Richard Hayes would return to his penthouse, to Hayes Development, to board meetings and balance sheets. The Sullivan women would remain here with their memories and their struggles. But something had shifted within Richard, a recalibration that made a simple return to his former life seem impossible. He set his phone aside and turned to Emma. "Before I go, I'd like to see more of your work, your architectural designs." Emma's surprise was evident. "Why?" "Professional curiosity," Richard replied. "I've reviewed portfolios from some of the top architecture firms in the country. I'd like to see how yours compares," Pride warred with suspicion on Emma's face. After a moment's hesitation, she disappeared upstairs, returning with a large portfolio case. She laid it on the coffee table and unzipped it carefully. "These are just student projects," she cautioned, spreading out several large renderings. "Nothing fancy." Richard examined the drawings with a developer's eye. The clean lines, the thoughtful integration of environment and structure, the practical considerations of space and light. What Emma dismissed as student projects showed remarkable sophistication and a distinctive aesthetic that set her work apart. "You have a unique perspective," he observed, studying a design for an adaptive reuse project that transformed an abandoned factory into a community arts center. "Most young architects focus on making statements. Your designs consider how people actually live and work in spaces." Emma shrugged, though he could tell his assessment pleased her. "That comes from growing up with Dad. He always said there's no point building something beautiful if it doesn't work for the people who have to use it every day." Richard nodded, moving to the next drawing. "Jack's influence is evident in your structural intuition. You understand building from the foundation up, not just as abstract design." He continued through the portfolio, asking questions about specific choices, noting the evolution of her style across projects. His interest was genuine. Emma Sullivan had real talent, the kind that couldn't be taught in even the most prestigious programs. What she lacked was opportunity. "The University of Michigan would be lucky to have you," he said finally, carefully returning the drawings to their case. "Rhode Island and Cornell as well. But Michigan's program would best suit your particular strengths." Emma's expression clouded. "It doesn't matter which program would suit me. I can't afford any of them." Richard met her gaze directly. "I'd like to fund your education." The words hung in the air between them. Linda, who had been quietly observing from the kitchen doorway, moved into the room, her face carefully neutral. "What do you mean?" Emma asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Exactly what I said. Full tuition, housing, expenses, whatever you need to complete your degree without financial concerns." Richard maintained a matter-of-fact tone, as if discussing a routine business transaction rather than a life-altering proposal. Emma's eyes narrowed. "Why would you do that?" "Because you have exceptional talent that shouldn't go to waste," Richard replied simply. "And because I owe your family a debt that can never truly be repaid." "We don't want your blood money," Emma said sharply, though uncertainty flickered beneath her defiance. "Emma," Linda cautioned softly. Richard leaned forward, his expression earnest. "This isn't charity, Emma. And it's not an attempt to ease my conscience. It's an investment in potential, yours and mine." "What does that mean?" Emma demanded. "It means that when you graduate, Hayes Development would benefit from having an architect who understands both design excellence and the human cost of cutting corners." Richard held her gaze. "Someone who would never sign off on a project until every safety concern was addressed, who would put people before profits. Someone like you." Emma shook her head. "You want to buy me, make me part of Hayes Development as some sort of, what? Living memorial? The daughter of a man your company killed, now designing your buildings? That's sick." "No," Richard countered, and calmly. "I want to offer you the opportunity your father would have wanted for you. And yes, I want to transform Hayes Development into a company that prioritizes safety and human dignity. Who better to help lead that transformation than someone who understands exactly what happens when those priorities are ignored?" Linda stepped closer, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Emma, listen to what Mr. Hayes is offering." "It's not that simple, Mom," Emma protested. "You can't just throw money at this and make everything okay." "You're right," Richard acknowledged. "Nothing can bring back your father or undo the harm my company caused. But this isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a different future." Emma looked away, conflict evident in every line of her body. The opportunity she'd dreamed of was being handed to her by the man she'd spent years hating. Wrapped in language that made refusal seem both petty and self-defeating. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Richard nodded, understanding her reluctance. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He reached into his pocket for a business card, then paused, recognizing the irony of such a formal gesture after the night they'd shared. Emma retreated to the basement workshop, the one place in the house where she still felt her father's presence most strongly. The space remained largely unchanged since his death, tools hanging in their designated spots, projects in various stages of completion, waiting patiently for hands that would never return to them. She ran her fingers along the scarred workbench, remembering weekends spent here watching her father transform raw materials into functional beauty. In the corner sat his last unfinished project, a cedar birdhouse he'd been building for their backyard. The pieces were carefully cut, sanded smooth, ready for assembly. 5 years later, it remained exactly as he'd left it, neither completed nor discarded. Emma picked up the half-finished birdhouse, studying the precision of the joints, the careful beveling of the edges. Jack Sullivan never cut corners, even on the simplest projects. He was going to paint it red, Linda said from the stairs. Said the Cardinals would appreciate the irony. Emma smiled despite herself. That sounds like Dad. Linda crossed the workshop and stood beside her daughter, both of them holding the unfinished project between them. He's upstairs, Emma said quietly. The man responsible for Dad's death is sitting in our living room on Christmas morning, offering to pay for my education. Linda nodded, her expression thoughtful. Life takes strange turns, doesn't it? How can you be so calm about this? Emma demanded. How can you offer him coffee and breakfast after everything his company did to us? Oh, Emma, Linda sighed, setting the birdhouse carefully back on the workbench. Do you think I've forgotten for 1 second what happened? Do you think a day goes by that I don't miss your father? Then how can you even consider accepting his offer? It feels like we're selling out, like we're saying what happened doesn't matter anymore. Linda was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The night your father died, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I wouldn't let grief and anger consume me, that I would find a way to keep living, really living, not just existing, because that's what Jack would have wanted. She took Emma's hands in hers. Your father wasn't a man who held grudges. Remember Mr. Daltrey next door? How he accidentally backed over Dad's new table saw? Emma nodded, remembering the expensive tool her father had saved months to purchase, destroyed in an instant of carelessness. Your father was angry for about 10 minutes, Linda continued. Then he was over at Daltrey's house the next weekend, helping him fix his roof. Said there was no point wasting energy on anger when it could be put to better use. This is different. Mom, this isn't an accident. Hayes Development knowingly cut corners to save money. Yes, they did, Linda agreed, and nothing will ever make that right. But the question now is what your father would want for you. For us, would he want you to work 2 jobs and attend community college when you have the talent for so much more? Would he want you to sacrifice your dreams to preserve your anger? Emma turned away, unable to answer. The truth was, she knew exactly what her father would say. Jack Sullivan had always pushed her to reach for more, to use her talents to their fullest. Build something that lasts, he'd told her countless times. Something that makes a difference. Mr. Hayes is offering you a chance to do exactly what your father always wanted for you, Linda said gently. Not because he's a good man, but because you deserve it. Because your talent shouldn't be wasted. But accepting his money feels like forgiving him. And I'm not sure I can do that. Forgiveness isn't something we give others, Emma. It's something we give ourselves. Linda picked up the unfinished birdhouse again. This has been sitting here for 5 years. Neither finished nor thrown away. Just waiting, like you've been waiting. Suspended between the past and the future. Emma looked at the pieces of the birdhouse. So carefully crafted. Meant to shelter and nurture life, abandoned before it could fulfill its purpose. I'm afraid, she admitted quietly. Afraid that if I let go of this anger, I'll lose Dad all over again. It's been the one constant since he died. The one thing I could count on. Linda wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her close. Your father is in your hands when you draw, in your eye for structure, in your laugh that sounds just like his. He's in how you double-check measurements and insist on doing things right the first time. You couldn't lose him if you tried. Upstairs, they could hear Richard moving about, his footsteps a reminder of the choice awaiting her. Accept his offer and step into a future her father had dreamed for her, or reject it and cling to an anger that had defined her for 5 years. What would Dad do? Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. Linda smiled, a bittersweet blend of grief and pride. He'd build something that lasts, something that makes a difference. Emma looked at the unfinished birdhouse one last time, then turned toward the stairs. It was time to complete what had been left undone. Not just the cedar, structure on the workbench, but her own interrupted journey. Richard stood by the window, watching the plows clear the street. His driver had texted he could be there within the hour. The snow-covered world was gradually returning to normal, systems resuming their functions, order reasserting itself. Yet Richard himself felt fundamentally altered, as if the night in the shed had rearranged something essential within him. He heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to see Emma and Linda emerging from the basement. Something in their expressions told him a decision had been reached. He straightened, preparing himself for either outcome. Emma approached him directly, her posture more resolved than defiant now. "I have conditions," she said without preamble. Richard raised an eyebrow, surprised but also impressed. Not acceptance or rejection, but negotiation. The daughter of a builder, indeed. "I'm listening," he replied. Emma took a deep breath. "First, this arrangement isn't between me and you personally. It's between me and Hayes Development, a formal scholarship program established in writing with my father's name on it." Richard nodded. "Reasonable. We can set up the Jack Sullivan Memorial Scholarship for Architecture." "Second," Emma continued, The scholarship won't just be for me. After I graduate, it continues for other students who couldn't otherwise afford architecture school. Preference given to children of construction workers. Linda's eyes widened slightly at her daughter's boldness, but Richard merely nodded again, a new respect evident in his expression. Third, Emma said, her voice strengthening, Hayes Development implements a new safety protocol, a real one, not just on paper. Workers can report concerns anonymously, with a third-party review process that can't be overridden by project managers or executives. That would require significant restructuring of our current procedures, Richard observed, though his tone was thoughtful rather than dismissive. Exactly, Emma replied firmly. Fourth, you personally meet with Miguel Ortiz's widow and David Chen's family. Not with lawyers present, not as a publicity stunt, just you, acknowledging what happened and listening to what they have to say, just like you did with us. Richard's jaw tightened momentarily. This condition struck closer to home, requiring personal rather than corporate action. After a moment, he nodded. I can do that. Is there more? Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out something she'd brought up from the basement, a small piece of cedar wood, sanded smooth and shaped into a perfect corner joint. One last thing, she said, holding up the wooden piece. When I start at Michigan next fall, I don't want to feel like I've been bought. This isn't about wiping the slate clean or pretending the past didn't happen. My father died because of decisions made at Hayes Development. That doesn't go away with a scholarship. I understand, Richard said quietly. Emma met his gaze directly. So I need to know that this is about moving forward, not erasing what happened. I need to know that Hayes Development will become a company my father would have been proud to work. Before, Richard considered her words carefully, recognizing their importance. This wasn't merely about funding one student's education or implementing new safety protocols. Emma Sullivan was asking him to fundamentally transform the company he'd built, to redefine its core values and priorities. I can promise you this, he said finally. Hayes Development will change, not overnight and not without resistance. There are board members, shareholders, executives who will fight to maintain the status quo. But I built this company, and I have the authority to reshape it. He paused, choosing his next words with care. Your father's death and the deaths of Miguel Ortiz and David Chen, those will not be footnotes in our corporate history. They will be the catalyst for genuine transformation. Emma studied his face, searching for any hint of corporate platitudes or empty promises. Finding none, she extended her hand, offering the wooden joint she'd been holding. This is from my dad's last project, she explained. A perfect corner joint, the kind that holds everything together, that makes a structure sound. He taught me that the strength of a building isn't in its visible features, but in how the pieces connect where no one can see. Richard accepted the small piece of wood, understanding its significance, both as symbol and challenge. Emma reached into her other pocket and withdrew Richard's business card, which he had given her earlier. With deliberate movements, she tore it precisely in half, then took a piece of tape from a dispenser on a nearby table and carefully rejoined the two halves. This is us, she said, handing him the taped card. Broken but mended, not erased, not forgotten, but rebuilt into something different, something that might actually work. Richard looked down at the mended card, his name and title now bisected by a thin line of tape, a visible reminder of fracture and repair. I accept your conditions, he said, pocketing both the wooden joint and the taped card. All of them. Linda, who had been watching this exchange silently, stepped forward and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Jack would be proud, she said softly. Emma nodded, emotions playing across her features, grief and hope, loss and possibility, the complex alchemy of moving forward while honoring the past. Outside, the sun broke fully through the clouds, sending brilliant shafts of light across the snow-covered yard. The ice-encased world glittered with promise, beautiful despite, or perhaps because of, the storm that had created it. 1 year later, snow fell gently over the Sullivan Christmas tree lot, the flakes lazily drifting rather than driving horizontally as they had the previous year. Richard Hayes pulled his car into the small gravel parking area, noting the "sold out" sign hanging from the booth. He smiled to himself. Linda had mentioned business was better this season. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed he wasn't driving the luxury sedan of last year. The sleek BMW had been replaced with a more practical SUV, better suited for site visits and carrying architectural models. Small changes reflecting larger ones. Linda spotted him from the porch and waved, hurrying down to meet him. "You made it." Emma was worried the conference would run late. "I wouldn't miss this," Richard assured her, retrieving a bottle of wine from the passenger seat. The conference was interesting, but family comes first. The word family still felt new on his tongue, not quite natural, but no longer foreign either. The past year had reintroduced Richard Hayes to concepts he'd long abandoned: connection, belonging, purpose beyond profit. "Emma's inside putting the finishing touches on dinner," Linda said, leading him toward the house. "She's been cooking all day, said she learned some Italian recipe from her roommate." Richard nodded, having heard about the roommate in Emma's weekly updates from Michigan. The first semester had been challenging but rewarding, her talent flourishing in an environment that nurtured rather than constrained it. Her most recent project had won departmental recognition, a redesign of worker housing for construction sites that emphasized both safety and dignity. The Sullivan home looked different from his last visit. The porch had been rebuilt, the exterior freshly painted, small improvements made possible by the changes of the past year. Linda had reduced her hospital hours to focus on expanding the tree lot business, which had thrived under her full attention. Inside, delicious aromas filled the air as Emma moved confidently around the kitchen. She looked up when they entered, her face breaking into a genuine smile. "Right on time," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "How was the conference?" "Productive," Richard replied. "Your safety protocol presentation made quite an impression." On the industry panel, several developers asked for follow-up meetings. Emma nodded, pleased but not surprised. The Jack Sullivan Safety Initiative had become a cornerstone of Hayes Development's new corporate identity, not just internal policy, but an industry-leading approach being adopted by competitors. "Did you bring it?" she asked, nodding toward his empty hands. "In the car," Richard confirmed, needed both hands for the wine. "I'll help you get it," Emma offered, already reaching for her coat. Together they walked back to his SUV, where a small evergreen waited in the back, the last tree from the Sullivan lot, saved specifically for this evening. "It's perfect," Emma declared, helping him lift it out. "Mom's been saving the spot by the window all month." They carried the tree together, this unlikely pair forged in tragedy and tentative redemption. The CEO and the architecture student, the man who had lost his way, and the young woman who had helped him find it again. Linda had cleared a space in the living room where the tree stand waited. With practiced movements, they secured the evergreen, its fresh pine scent filling the room and mingling with the cooking aromas from the kitchen. "I have something for it," Richard said, reaching into his pocket and producing a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. Emma unwrapped it carefully to reveal a handcrafted ornament, a miniature wooden crane, meticulously detailed, with the names Jack Sullivan, Miguel Ortiz, and David Chen engraved on its base. "The first of its kind," Richard explained. "Every Hayes development project will have one displayed prominently in the management office from now on, a reminder of why our safety protocols matter." Emma turned the ornament over in her hands, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's beautiful," she said simply. "There's more," Richard continued, pulling an envelope from his inner pocket. The Jack Sullivan Memorial Scholarship received its first external applications this week. The committee would like you to review them, if you're willing. Emma accepted the envelope, understanding its significance. The first of many, she said. Linda brought out a box of ornaments, the familiar collection of family memories and handmade treasures. Shall we decorate while dinner finishes? As they hung ornaments on the tree, Richard noticed the mended business card he had returned to Emma last Christmas, now framed and sitting on a shelf alongside family photographs. Beside it stood Jack's finished birdhouse, finally completed, painted the bright red he had intended for the cardinals. The acceptance letter came yesterday, Emma mentioned casually, as she hung a handmade star near the top of the tree. Richard raised an eyebrow. The internship program? Emma nodded. Hayes Development's summer architecture internship. Looks like you'll be stuck with me for 3 months next year. The selection committee has excellent taste, Richard replied with a smile. Knowing that Emma's application had been evaluated anonymously, her acceptance earned entirely on merit. When the tree was fully decorated, they stood back to admire their work, the same mismatched collection of ornaments Richard had seen the previous year, now joined by the wooden crane and a few new additions, including a small University of Michigan pennant and a miniature architectural model Emma had crafted. Linda reached for the light switch, and the tree came alive with a warm, multicolored glow. In its branches hung the history of a family. Their joys and sorrows, their losses and recoveries, their past and their future. "Merry Christmas," Linda said softly as they stood together in the gentle light. Richard looked at the tree, at the home, at the 2 women who had inadvertently helped him find his way back to humanity, and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Belonging. "Merry Christmas," he echoed, knowing that some gifts can't be purchased, only earned through the painful, necessary work of redemption.